On behalf of the IIP, the From Punishment to Public Health Initiative, and the Institute for Justice and Opportunity, I want to thank you for joining our panel discussion on the Emmy Award-winning documentary, Ernie and Joe, Crisis Cops. After this panel is over, we will post the full video as well as additional resources on the remote panel discussions page on our website, which will be linked in the chat. To stay up to date on all of our events, please follow us on our socials at IIP_John J. We invite you to send questions throughout this panel. You can click the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send the question directly to the host. At the IIP, we have adopted the practice of doing a living land acknowledgement for all of our events. This is specific to New York City, but we highly encourage all of our listeners to learn and acknowledge your local history wherever you may be. The IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their lands with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. Now I will turn it over to Jeff Coots, Director of the From Punishment to Public Health Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna, and welcome to everyone who is joining us this afternoon in the early evening. We appreciate you coming indoors on such a beautiful day to have this event with us. I want to thank Shauna and others, Michelle and Matt, who did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen. And I really appreciate everybody's efforts in pulling this together. We are thrilled to be bringing this screening event to you all this evening. Hopefully many of you have been able to view the full-length documentary. In a little bit, we're going to be showing a condensed version of the film and then hearing from a couple of panelists, including one of the officers who was in the film. So I just wanted to give a quick acknowledgement to Shawana Vaughn, who will be joining us as a panelist. She is the founder and director of Silent Cry Incorporated, where she draws on her own lived experience to help those returning home from prison and with communities most impacted by mass incarceration. She is currently enrolled as a justice scholar at Columbia University in New York City. So we welcome Shawana. And Joe Samaro will also be joining us later on. Joe is a Marine Corps veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2005, he joined the San Antonio Police Department, where he helped to form the mental health unit that has now grown to be recognized for best practices in police interactions with individuals facing acute mental health crises. And he is the founder and CEO of Solution Point Plus, a national training and consulting firm that focuses on cultivating mental wellness to maximize human capital and promote safety within organizations. And so again, we are thrilled. As Shauna mentioned, we have 3 different research organizations from John Jay co-hosting this event. When the opportunity came to us and Kathy made this available to us, we all jumped at the opportunity, recognizing how important and timely this issue is, particularly as we go into a new administration at the federal level. And so we are gonna transition now into the film version. It's about 25 minutes. And we look forward to sticking around with our panelists afterwards. So we are now pleased to share with you all a condensed 25-minute version of the Emmy Award-winning HBO film, Ernie and Joe, Crisis Cops, directed by filmmaker Jennifer McShane. And as noted earlier, the full-length film will be active for registrants until midnight tomorrow if you haven't had a chance to watch it. And we'll have a chance to speak with Joe and Shawana after the viewing, and we'll be taking questions from the audience. And so there will be a Q&A function as we're going through the panel for you all. Wow. Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to turn my video back on. I have to give some gratitude to Kathy Lecter and her team just for editing that. I've seen the full run twice, and that snapshot hits on all the major pieces. that are in the longer thing. Still worth it to watch the entire thing if you hadn't already. There's actually a beautiful segment where they go and meet the woman who that we just saw on the bridge, and she is on the path in her recovery, and they have a chance to engage with her, and it's a really beautiful scene there, and you get to see that come full circle. So perhaps that alone is worth it. Shawana, I want to start with you about and hear from you a little bit about your reaction to the film. Initially, I know we talked a little bit about this last week, but as somebody who works with those who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system, somebody who has personal experience in, and you've expressed, just the real challenge of finding mental health services upon reentry, and that's a real barrier for people both inside and out. What was your initial reaction, or kind of your evolving reaction to the film? And then also, how do you see this film and others like it as an opportunity to use as a tool for change in the work that you do?
Oh my God. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Joe, and your partner for all that you guys are doing to change the stigma of mental health and what that looks like, especially in law enforcement. My hat off to you for that. I have legislation called post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawana W76337, and it's a mass incarceration mental health bill. And what I got out of watching this documentary was hope. We are clear that there are challenges with mental health and inside and out. And I watched Joe and his partner, where most people in most cases would have been shot and killed or harmed, tased at the least. Everybody that they encountered left with help, resources, and unharmed. I think it's a great model for the entire country. I think that if you could figure out how to mass produce yourselves, but I would really like to get to the core of what is so different about San Antonio Police Department and the unit that you work for, and how can we model this for people, for guards, for people incarcerated, and how do we model this behavior in minority communities where we know that mental health disorders are not treated the same and not addressed. But I've watched you do a great job in this documentary of a blueprint of where we start. And I think that's amazing because we need to start somewhere. And I think you guys are doing an outstanding job in where you are. And I would love to see what this looks like for the rest of the country, especially New York. And I want to see how this models for people that are incarcerated. Because I think you've taken a holistic approach to healing, and you have resources with the approach. You have places for people to go. And I think that's important because a lot of people, a lot of precincts or prisons don't have resources. And so I think that you are absolutely doing an amazing job for the country. I wish the country would follow your lead on this one. I think you reduce recidivism. I think you reduce incarceration because we're using prison as a mental health facility, and that's not what it is. So definitely thank you.
Well, Shawana, you set me up excellently there, because my question to Joe is, we see in the film Joe and Ernie exhibiting unique skill sets that we don't see broadly applied. And so, Joe, we talked about this a little last week, but I wanted you to share with our audience here kind of how and why are you able to utilize those skill sets and draw upon the communication skills that you have, the kind of what you term the active listening, and even with the woman on the bridge that we saw there, like thanking her, and then the handshake to build trust, and using these, they're little like kind of tips and tricks, but you use them effortlessly. And so how did you come to possess these and then put them into action in the line of work, as we see so well in the film there?
Yeah, Jeff, and thank you, Shawana, for everything you just said. It really does mean a lot to me when I hear people really get behind this idea that there really is hope, because it is possible. And so I appreciate everything you just said. And while I've seen that 25-minute version now probably 4 or 5 times, I agree with you as well, Jeff. It was just so beautifully done by Jen McShane and Toby, who won the Emmy for Best Editing. But just what a great gift they had to take. That was 3 years of shooting, of recording, for those that don't know, and over 300 hours of footage to condense it down to 96 minutes. So to specifically answer your question, Jeff, it's a choice, right? It's easy to do the easy thing. And the easy thing is to show up, act like you don't have time, act like you're always in a hurry because the most important thing is the next call, act like, there's all these like external pressures, which oftentimes aren't necessarily true. And if you just, I'll tell you, for me, it was, I really had to challenge the mindset that the police academy trained me for. And it took me about 2 years. And so after I had 2 years on patrol, I had this like realization one day that, which is why, and this was before the mental health unit existed, but I had this realization of like, wait a minute, like I show up to work almost every single night, a little bit anxious, a little bit worried, a little bit afraid. And every call I get dispatched to, I'm kind of scared, because for 7.5 months, I've been told I'm going to be killed. For 7.5 months, I've been told that I'm going to get ambushed and I'm going to die while I'm eating my dinner at 2 a.m. and while I'm at a gas station. And I saw countless videos of officers being killed. And it was just instilling paranoia, in my opinion. And so after I didn't die in those first 2 years, and I wasn't even close to death, I started to realize, like, wait a minute, what if there's like another version of this story? And I reflected on like the absolute data I had of 2 years of like, yeah, I had been into a couple like, skirmishes with some people that didn't want to go to jail or something, but it was nothing like what I was prepared to do. And so then I started to kind of think, is there a better way to do this? The answer was yes. And then there was this perfect collision between me having my own ultimate level of suffering, where I was at probably like one of the several rock bottoms of my life. And I re-engaged into services through the VA. I started going to therapy. And then I realized that I'm no different than the people that I'm helping every single day. Like I'm no different. I'm struggling. I have issues in my relationships. I'm dealing with child support. I'm dealing with all these stressors. Why am I in any different position than the person I'm helping? And so then I saw it really as like a point of gratitude of like, by the grace of God, am I on this side of the 911 call today? Because, it's just one of those things where it really did come down to choice, challenging your beliefs, and then understanding that people are not their problems. And if you see people as their problems, regardless of why you're there, it's going to be very easy for you to justify in your mind, I'm going to hurry up or snatch them up or put hands on them or tase them or do whatever I have to do, because you're not seeing them as humans. You're seeing them as problems or burdens or barriers to you getting off on time, or barriers to you going to eat, or barriers to your frustration. And this is one of the big issues too, with like officers not dealing with their own stuff and having a lot of unprocessed trauma. Hopefully that answers your question, Jeff.
Yes, thank you. So Shawana, I wanted you to go back to what you said about, I know that you're championing some legislation right now. And so when you hear Joe talk about the strategies that he employs, the ways that he relates to the other officers that are on the staff, what are some of the things that you're hoping to achieve through the legislation? How are you looking to have the impact that you want to have? Because legislation is one thing, and then it has to be rolled out. And so how do we ensure that what you have in that, couple pages of text there really translates into real reform for people who are incarcerated in New York State?
It looks like I've asked for vendor therapy because we're clear that, people that are working inside incarceration not fit to work out here. And so it looks like, vendor therapists like the lady on my board who is Dr. Carol Ann Hunt Griffin, and she's amazing. It looks like people like Joe and Ernie coming in and training other correctional officers and staff on what proper mental health behavior looks like. It's not punitive. And my takeaway, Joe, is so powerful. You've actually helped my next piece of legislation and you just don't know it. Because I believe that there's a holistic approach to healing. And you said something so powerful right now. You said, but by the grace of God, you're on the other end of the 911 call today. And you said you have the same problems as the other people. And that makes them human and it makes you human. But you also said something else. You got 700 hours of training that made you think that you were going to die. My father was a detective in Bakersfield, California. He wanted to come home like you, like everybody. He didn't take everybody to jail and he never died either. But he community policed his neighborhood and it loved him back. My legislation looks like men like my father. My legislation looks like men like you and Joe. You and Ernie. It looks like therapists that are trauma informed. It looks like we're no longer being punitive to the act, but empathetic to the issue. And so I'm calling for vendor therapy. I'm calling for holistic ways to treat people that are suffering from mental disorders, art therapy, talk therapy, everything until you get to medication. And some people need it and you have to give it to them. But there are alternatives and Joe, you and your partner Ernie and your unit just showed the world what is possible. So I know that my legislation is possible because I'm watching you carry it out. And so I would love to sit with you and see actually what that looks like for other states and other people. Because you're right. How many hours do correctional officers and police officers get of trauma-informed therapy, trauma-informed care for themselves, and mental health trainings? I watch you guys do exercises with acting out and your role play, because you always have to be the other person to be empathetic. And like you said, you went to work scared, and this is why people die. People don't die. It's the scary person with a gun, and that's on the same end of people in the street and people with a badge. You have to be trained differently, and it's working for you. I watched you in that courtroom when you talked the gentleman, and he went with you, and you said that the mental facility was around the corner. That's all it takes is patience. Like you said, we're not learning patience. We're not learning that we are the same person. And so I hope that my bill and my legislation looks like what you're modeling for people that are incarcerated and post-incarceration. Is exactly what I'm looking for. Is models and examples like your department in San Antonio.
Again, a great segue for me, Tawana. So you're 2 for 2 here. Joe, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the training experience that you have and the approach that you take to working with officers, both about self-care, understanding their own mental health issues and challenges and PTSD, and following along that path that you have in seeking self-care, and then also in working with clients that they meet out in the community when they're on patrol. And particularly if you can speak a little bit to something you want to touch on there, that it's just a small dose of training that you get to have with them. It's a small amount of time that you get to have with them. And there's a saying in the advocacy world that culture eats policy for breakfast, and that we can change policies, we can write new rules and regs, but the culture of the institution is going to really win out there. And so when you're working with folks in this small dose of time, maybe you're able to come back and reinforce some of those things. How do you break through and see the behavioral change on their end as operators, so that we can see the behavioral change in the community that we want to see?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I love it. And actually, right now I'm in Iowa and I'm sitting in a police chief's office. He's letting me use. And Shawana, I'm happy to report that this room right across from me that Jesse and I are teaching is a room filled with correction officers. There's only 3 patrol officers, and then we have like 13 or 14 correctional officers, and then 2 civilians from the Area Crime Commission. And so it is important to me that it's this holistic approach. Like you said, everyone needs to be on the same page because it's a systemic issue. It's not just a law enforcement issue. It's an access to care issue. It's not just an access to care issue. It's a funding issue. And so there's so many layers to this problem, to be sure. But to your question specifically, Jeff, you're absolutely right. If we come in, I've met with police chiefs and sheriffs, and I told them this: don't use us as a PR pony to get a public win. Because if you don't buy into this, if you don't believe in this, don't just bring us in to have a feel good for like a week so you can like say, oh, I'm doing a great thing. Because if we just come in and do one training one time and then that's it, like what have you really done? That's not going to lead to behavior change. Now, the other side of that same coin, I would argue, is you never know who you're going to have in a room. And so what we've learned is that even in small groups in rural Iowa that we're in right now, where we're doing a room of 15, they are eating it up and it's Monday. And these people are so hungry. And I tell people, like, when they ask about Solution Point Plus and what we're doing, I say we're in the business of helping people remember, because I really believe that people become this, they take this job on for the right reasons. I really believe that 99% of people want to get into first responder capacity, dispatch, fire, EMS, police, same thing with military, nurses, doctors. Like we get into these professions because we like people. We want to like help people. We want to serve humanity. And then we become morally injured, and the system really oppresses and the system frustrates. And in law enforcement specifically, I think what happens is over time, you start to become more and more detached because you forget that you're a human being. You forget that you're dealing with human beings. You're starting to get frustrated with, I have a slide up in one of my classes and says, as a self-assessment, like what first comes to mind if I say, how do you feel about people? And without fail, someone in the group's like, oh, people suck. People are this and it's that. And it's like, why do you feel that way? Because you've allowed yourself to believe that the very small subset of people that you deal with on your calls while on duty is a fair representation of the world around you. And it's just not the case. But we close off the people around us. We close off the world. We really start to emotionally detach. And that's what leads to the problem, where I think the latest numbers, according to Psychology Today, were 18 to 36% of law enforcement officers qualify for PTSD. I know there's a longitudinal study done by Dr. John Mann at Columbia, and he found that 10% of every police agency in this country is suffering in silence from depression, diagnosable depression. Officers are not doing a good enough job taking care of themselves, but agencies are not doing a good enough job of supporting their officers and creating or allowing robust resiliency type programs that the focus, because here's my opinion, if you want to change the country, if you want to change the world, it's an inside job. It all starts with me. And if we get to the hearts and the minds of the officers to help them remember why they're doing this in the first place. I told them this morning when I was doing my opening remarks, no one's making you do these jobs. If you're frustrated, if you're pissed off, if you're mad about it, you can choose to leave. But in our mindset, in our fixed mindset, it's like, I'm stuck doing this. I have to go into work. And it's like, or you don't. And we shouldn't be mad about doing these jobs. We should be grateful. And I tell them with the same thing, all these calls, whether it's a suicide in progress call, or it's someone who's mentally ill, or whatever it is, be grateful that this person who doesn't know you at all is comfortable enough to open up to you about their like medical history, or they're telling you their diagnosis when they have no clue who you are. And instead of being like, oh God, another person with schizophrenia, like, wow, I get another opportunity to help someone who needs help. And isn't that why I came into this in the first place? And so it's really about reframing perspective, to remember why you're doing this in the first place. And I try really hard to help remind them gently. And sometimes I poke them in their eye because I can. But I remind them as gently as possible of like, why are you doing this? And I think we forgot over time. But really, I think mandatory mental health appointments should be I think it should be a mandate. I think every department should make their officers go to at least one mental health appointment every year, at least one. I think it should be quarterly, but they should have forced check-ins so they have an opportunity. That's how you start to really shift the culture. Because just saying we have CIT, that's not a wellness program. It's an awareness piece, but it's not a wellness program. And I think you can start developing those things by saying, we're going to mandate mental health appointments for every officer every year. And that way we provide some normalcy to this idea that going to therapy is okay, which everyone in this job really does need. I think every human being needs a therapist. That was my TED talk. But yeah, I think those are just a couple ways to really address that need and really change things for the better.
And so I want to dovetail off of that and just name a couple of things that I'm seeing in the Q&A piece here, which are things that we knew that we wanted to cover as well, which was one that, so in New York City, obviously this is live cast, we're able to be all over the country, which is great as we're doing things over Zoom, but hosted by an institution that's in New York City. We have crisis intervention team trainings for police officers. They're kind of making their way through the officers that were already on the force. And then it's a mandatory part of the police academy now. But there's, 20,000 uniformed officers in the city, and they're doing their best to work their way through it. And they started that about 5 years ago now. And we have a co-response team. And so that means that there's, the car that goes out, the squad car that goes out with the 2 officers. And then there's also mental health clinicians. There's also some pilot programs throughout the city where it's this cahoots model, which is just pure, no police involved. It's just a pure mental health dispatch to certain calls. And you've got to kind of jury rig the 911 response mechanisms so that you can direct the appropriate calls to those folks. And yet we still have fatalities when police are responding to individuals in mental health crisis. And so, a couple of the people are saying, how do we feel, both Shawana and Joe, how do we feel about those kind of 3 models that we have there? Do we need to be scaling them? Do we need to be expanding them, or positives and challenges in them? And then how do we, when we have those things available, make sure that it's the right squad car that gets there? And so, Joe, that's probably a logistical question for you more so, but like when you are on shift, or when you guys were on your weekend shift and you were uniformed, how are you the ones that get to the call in time? And how do we make sure that it's the people who have been through at least the CIT training that are the ones responding to the call for help from a family member or the community at large?
Yeah, it's CIT has been around since 1987. It's nothing new, but yet still a vast majority of the police departments in this nation don't have it. It should be a mandatory minimum, no questions asked. The problem still is, I've seen some really, really sad programs that call themselves CIT programs. One of the issues is there's way too much autonomy on how you deliver this. Even locally back in San Antonio and a surrounding area, I saw they had a jailer just assigned all of the PowerPoints for the whole week, and she just stood there and read them. She had never been on a patrol call. She had no experience in mental health, and there was no role plays. That is not going to create the type of buy-in that we're looking for. And so I think it's also very careful that we don't just say, we need to mandate CIT. There really needs to be like some type of standardization or a quality program out there where it creates buy-in by credible people. And that's not a selfish plug. I know other people can do it well too. But it's for me, it's so important that, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, we're an overnight success that took about 13 years to figure out. And so we've been doing it long enough. We've tweaked it enough to say, this is a model that works. It's officer-led, it's community supported. There's a lot of collaboration with the stakeholders. It really is based on a lot of whatever resources are available to you. And you have to have this, like, just this cohesion between the law enforcement agency and the stakeholders and the treatment providers, and it should be co-presented. Now, as far as the models, on our department as a mental health unit, and there was 10 patrol officers. This is a city of 2 million people, department of 2,400. We were up to 10 officers, 2 detectives, 1 sergeant, 3 clinicians. So it's about 16 total. That was the whole makeup. And we were one of the only units that was given the ability to self-assign pending calls. So in the CAD, in the screen dispatched queue, we could see all the pending calls, and anything that was a mental health call, we could just self-assign. Patrol never gets dispatched, and we show up to it. But the problem is, we would handle probably 2%. In the movie, I said 5 to 7%. It's actually gone significantly down from that, and we're maybe handling 1 to 2% of the mental health calls, because I think there's like almost 3,000 a month mental health calls. We do about 1,200 emergency detentions or involuntary commitments per month, 12 to 1,400 as a department. Our unit of 10, we're doing a fraction of those. And so that's why it was important for the chief to say, we're going to mandate 100% of the training for everyone. But to someone else's point, I saw in the question was 40-hour training is mandated in whatever state it was. Sorry, I don't have it up, but is that enough? The answer is no. 40 hours of mental health training is a great introduction, but this is the problem, to Jeff's point, of culture. If you're still going to do, the perf report showed, and in the movie it talks about it, but it's a 58 hours of handgun manipulation and firearm drills versus 8 hours of communication and CIT or de-escalation. That shows where your priorities are. And so it should be, okay, yeah, 60 hours of firearm, you should know how to use it, you should know when to use it, when not to use it, sure. But then you should probably have 240 hours of mental health and de-escalation and communication training. I've long said that reform begins in the hiring process. We should be looking at how we're hiring, who we're hiring. We should raise the age, in my opinion, 25, 26. You should probably have to have a 4-year degree. If you don't have a 4-year degree, you should have at least 2 years of working in some type of social, community oriented, like, child protective services, adult protective services, but something where you can develop compassion and communication skills before you get a gun belt. And then because the prefrontal cortex isn't even developed till you're 26, why are we giving these young men and women the ability to take people's lives or their civil liberties before their brains even developed? Of course they're going to be impulsive. Of course they're going to be afraid. Of course they're going to respond a lot quicker. And beyond that, beyond the recruiting, the training, the entire training process for police officers in this country needs to be revamped. It just does. We should be spending far more time allowing human beings to remember that people are people are people. And despite how they look, despite where they live, despite the fact that they're poor, despite the fact that they're homeless, despite the fact that whatever it is, they're people. And they're either calling for love or they're acting out of love, right? It really is that simple, but we forget, and we get so overwhelmed with this idea that we don't like culturally appropriate people before we put them into these cities or the oppressed and marginalized areas of these big cities. It's like what we'll do is officers in most places get a wish list. Where do you want to work? Well, I want to work wherever the highest crime is. Why? Because I'm young, I'm eager, I want to chase people, I want to mix it up a little bit. And it's like, that's a recipe for disaster. And we shouldn't be putting these brand new young officers into the highest crime areas. And it's very easy to find out what your high crime areas are by doing a simple heat map. Everyone does it. They know where the issues are. Don't put your young officers in those areas. You should be putting your 20-year officers in those areas. Officers that have slowed down a lot. Officers that have really developed their communication styles. And I think in the training, it really needs to be focused on how can I develop an expert communicator. You should be like certified in basic hostage negotiation because it's a communication course. You should understand the basics of neuroscience and how the brain works. You should understand all things mental health as much as possible, because even for the ones that want to say law enforcement should not be responding to mental health calls, while I can, on the surface, I get that, I also believe that every 911 call has an emotional disturbance component to it, because people don't call the police when things are going well and they're happy. They're upset or mad about something. So we should have the basic understanding of human behavior, psychology, what's happening in the brain when people are in crisis, and how can I de-escalate that? You don't have to be a mental health expert, but you should be a person expert. You should be a human expert to at least have some basic understanding of what drives people. And I'll wrap with this is, I've said for a long time that if we were to do like use of force autopsies, if that was a thing, and just randomly select 100, 1,000, 10,000 random samples of use of force incidents that were on camera and peel back the layers, what percentage of those do you think would be instigated by the law enforcement officer? And it's a much, much higher percentage than cops would like to ever admit, because we don't want to own our responsibility. We think, well, if they didn't do that, or if they didn't say that, or if they didn't do this, I wouldn't have done this. And it's like, no, just because they said that doesn't mean you should have done what you have done. You could have just taken a step back and been patient. Now, again, this isn't me coming down on the cops. I'm just saying we have to be responsible for our portion. And too many people want to just project out and say, no, I wouldn't have done that if they didn't do this. And it's just not true. But oftentimes we fall back on, well, based on my training experience. And are they wrong? No, because their training experience was, you're going to die. You're going to die. There's a really good chance you're going to die. And here's what we know. In 2019, 48 cops were killed in the line of duty, 44 by a handgun, 236 killed themselves. So what's the problem? The problem is we lack self-care. We don't have individually whole and well officers that are creating like whole or well organizations, departments that then are welcoming and willing to work within their communities. Instead, we have a whole lot of initiatives and programs and things that we do, but a lot of it is ran by officers who are suffering, and they're not willing to do the work that's required to take care of themselves, and so they're not equipped to take care of other people. And I'm off my soapbox.
Well, it was a good one, so we appreciate it. Shawana, I have a good one here for you because it's about organizing strategies and saying, how can we as citizens get law enforcement agencies to choose a legitimate crisis intervention team training, and one of the more substantive pieces. And so I'm curious to hear, I know this isn't exactly on point with what your current focus is, but that you're working a lot with impacted communities, impacted individuals. What are the conversations amongst you and your allies and team around the kind of broader police reform conversations and reallocation of funding, and how that could have an impact on something like this, particularly in a place in big cities where the workforce development strategy is already robust and developed, and it includes a bunch of things we don't want, but they think those are priorities. So how do we get the training program to be something that those who are most impacted by these issues want to see in there?
I think one of the core issues, even in New York, I'm from California, but even here, we have people making decisions and saying what's best, and they don't have everybody at the table. People make decisions for police officers, but police are not even at the table. And I don't think that's where we're making the first mistake. I believe that you have to have programs implemented that are going to actually address the root causes, and it's accountability. And we have programs, but they have no accountability, and we give funding to things that don't work. And so, Joe just said a lot of key things. I think education, age, all play factors. And I believe that if every precinct had trauma-informed therapists, at least 3, to ride with calls that were dispatched for mental health, it would reduce harm. He also said something. Stop putting young officers in high crime neighborhoods. New York has a bad problem with doing this. We have to create programs that create wholeness. I think what Joe is doing around the country is creating wholeness. I believe that we have to have trainings, and we have to mandate more mental health hours. We have to. We have to create an open space for therapy to be okay. We have broken people protecting broken people. And so that can never be good. And we have to learn to heal as a community. And so I believe that we do need to give more money to social work programs that aid community and police. I hear defund, defund, defund. Well, my father was a cop. I'm formerly incarcerated, and I don't believe that any of us get it right. So I don't scream defund, but how do we fund better? We need more programs. We need more therapy. Joe, I agree with you. I'm going to be in therapy till I die. I think everybody needs to be there with us. But I definitely believe 700 hours of training of kill and fear, absolutely, unequivocally not. And so how do we do that? We write letters to police chiefs, police commissions, police unions. We galvanize as communities because we're not clear that they work for us, the taxpayer, and we demand that they do better because they still work for us. And if we believe they need 500 hours of therapy versus 700 hours of kill, then that's what they need to have. And I believe, learning to pull your trigger or tase a human or demean a human first, that's not the answer. We need to go back to community policing. And I think that's what Joe and Ernie and their team show a great job of. Community policing and what that actually means. We say it, but we don't know what it means. It's not just rhetoric and verbiage. It means I know the officers who are in my neighborhood because they're consistently going to be there. They know the people. They know the lay of the land. Everybody doesn't need to go to jail. Some people just need to go home. And some people just need to be talked to. But if you have people who don't know the lay of the land, they don't have the wherewithal or the mental capacity to even process it. Now we have collisions and murder and all sorts of things. And so I just think we need community policing. We need better training for police. We need better police engagement. But we're not going to get those things unless the trainings are different that they begin with. And I don't think that their training should begin military style. And that's the problem. They do. You're training civilian people to protect people, but you're teaching them to kill before you're teaching them to heal or to listen. And those are skills they don't have because that's not what they're being given. And so I believe, like you said, we can write legislation, but how do you implement it? So I just think it needs to be better implementation practices with real stakeholders. I mean, real ones, people that have been impacted by police at the stakeholder table, formerly incarcerated people at the table, police at the table, clergy at the table. I think young people should be at the table who are over policed in their neighborhoods. Because without a well-rounded group of individuals at the table, you can't make collective change. You just make change that's dictatorship because you didn't include everybody. And I think that is what's most needed, to reallocate money to do certain things that look holistic and to bring about awareness and change in our communities that's long lasting and create a path of community and wellness for police and community.
And I would just add too, I think, Shawana, the coalition building and the advocacy that you do and that groups like you all do is so important because when it comes to this moment when, for example, in New York, the governor issues an executive order, all the police departments have to submit a plan to their local legislative body that has to be voted and approved by their legislative body for those police departments to get any state funding next year, right? If if we don't have our ducks in a row for what we want to ask for at that table, if we're coming to that table just to start the conversation and we don't have those relationships and the plans in place, like, nope, it's written down right here, this is where we want to go, it's really difficult for us to have an impact on that. And so,
Absolutely.
kudos to the work that you and your team are doing. And you're already at the legislation phase, so that's that's wonderful to see. And I think one of the folks on the Q&A pointed out too that in part of this defund movement, things like CIT programs may be viewed as peripheral, and so they'll say, okay, let's cut that, and we're gonna shift over, and maybe we're just gonna hire clinicians. We're gonna try a different strategy on how to address that. And so that's another, I guess, kind of tactical question that I would pose both to Shawana and then Joe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. How do we continue to push for the things that we want to see without and recognizing that when we're bringing something new to the table, it costs money to implement? How do we push for those things without cannibalizing the successes that we've already achieved and losing ground in one lane while we're trying to gain ground in another, particularly with a lens towards training protocols, mental health resources being made available to officers? How do we sustain and expand the bucket rather than just kind of trade one out for another in times like these, where we're talking about budget reallocations and significant budget shortfalls that the state has to address due to the COVID shutdown earlier in the year?
Joe, you want to go?
Okay.
You guys haven't solved that problem yet?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. People ask about the whole defunding and like my take on it. And it's like, just like Shawana said, I think it's just words that, trigger people and they make them feel a certain way. Now, I think what's important is that we take an honest look at the existing budgets of any police department and find out like let's see where line by line these budget items are actually going, because a lot of agencies actually do have money. It's like anytime we talk to a department administrator and we're talking about the training and they're like, yeah, we just don't have the money for it. And it's like, you realize that you're gonna, like, let's just say, for example, you don't have the officers trained, they act wrong on a call, they get into some type of civil suit, there's a wrongful death, excited delirium, whatever it is, you're going to hold them on admin duty for months, paying their salary while there's some investigation, but you don't have time to train them. But this is a societal problem, is we're so reactive. Like, we'll deal with that if it happens. I don't want to deal with the prevention side of it. And so I think also you can look at where the money is being spent. A lot of departments, especially in these suburban areas, affluent areas, they have incredible toys. They have $1 million vehicles that they will never, ever, ever use, but it looks really cool. And they can bring it to the schools and the fairs, and they do all this cool stuff, but it's so obsolete to where they're actually operating. And so there's grant funding and there's federal dollars that get pushed down for them to buy all this incredible equipment that they just don't need based on. So it's like, hey, could we use this money for, I don't know, maybe we're going to better train our agency, or we're going to create some type of program where we are going to do a co-responder model, or we're going to hire a handful of clinicians so that we can start looking at things differently. I think it's not just a matter of, hey, should we defund the police or just give these mental health calls to clinicians that are city ran or government ran. That might be a great idea, but it's years away from happening effectively. And people who are just jumping into it really don't have any clue, because if you're a bachelor's level person who has some education on psychology, or if you're a licensed master's level clinician, you're not trained in crisis management. And just because you know how to do an assessment or you know how to like do therapy in a controlled environment doesn't mean you know how to show up to someone's house when they're actively psychotic and they're flailing around or doing something. And so it could be potentially a dangerous situation. But it's the same thing with the officers. The officers have a gun belt to use with tasers, pepper sprays, asp batons, and firearms. And that's where you see terrible things happen. A civilian clinician without the guidance or protection of a uniformed officer or a plainclothes officer, they're just out there on an island without the proper training. And so I think we have to be really smart about how we do these reforms. But yeah, I don't think that it's been solved yet, Jeff, to be honest. It's one of these things where I think you're right. A lot of people are showing up and saying words, and it's saying we're quick to grab at initiatives and things and like create acronyms and do all these things that like make us feel good in the moment, but they're either not sustainable or again, you don't have the full behavioral change yet because you don't have the culture addressed. And I think this is the problem with, we work backwards sometimes. We put the cart before the horse a lot, especially when change is being forced from the outside in and it's not being embraced from the inside out. And I think that really for something to be lasting and sustainable, we have to look at how can we really create change in turn. Because again, I love what Shawana said. So many times there's these new things that happen where you don't have the people who it affects the most at the table to have a voice in that. And so then human behavior is we resist change naturally, right? I mean, our brains are wired for protection, not connection, yet we seek this idea of this utopian world where whether you're a police officer or you're a clinician or you're a first responder in any capacity, our goal would always be connection first. Well, that's great, but our brains are wired for protection first. And we see the world as scary or dangerous or a threat. And so how do we really deal with those? And just throwing an initiative or a program at it isn't going to fix it. I love the fact that New York, the governor is saying like, yeah, we're going to do this. And there's teeth in it, like you said, because if you don't have a plan in place, you don't get funding next year. So people are going 100 miles an hour right now trying to throw something together. But you also know what that looks like, right? People are just going to be piecemealing things together. And it's not going to be well thought out. They're going to be and then ego is a real thing, right? And people are like, I want to own this and I want credit for this and I want my name on this and I want to create this new acronym called Get 'em or like help.now or whatever it is. And it's just like, man, how does that really help in the grand scheme of things? I love that conversations are being had, but I think it's important that we really take the people who are most effective. I heard this a couple weeks ago and I thought it was brilliant. If you're trying to address the mental health system, the best way to do it is to bring the people who use it the most, which are the end users, the people who suffer from mental illness, bring them in, again, using common sense, the ones who are well enough to be able to like talk through it and say, hey, in a perfect world, what would you like to see happen? If you're in crisis, who would you call? Would it be law enforcement? Would it be a clinician? Who would it be? Okay, let's work through this. And you kind of work from the end up to create what an ideal program would look like for the user. But us telling them how they should do it or how it should be is just not going to be effective. People are going to resist it left and right. And Shawana agrees because she's nodding her head.
Joe, I definitely agree with you. I don't think it should be therapist against police either. I think it has to be collectively together. And I don't give New York kudos for this new governor's plan. I've been on the Zoom calls. They're utterly insane. Because now you have everybody screaming, but nobody has a plan. And again, it's too many people at the table right now. And they don't even have a clue what's going on at the table. And I think that you have to be selective at who's at the table, but you definitely have to be inclusive at the same time. And like you said, Joe, ask the people who are well enough to be at the table, what would they like to see? And this is why I said, defund is not the answer. And you're right. People latch on to words and words matter, especially in this climate. And we have to absolutely stop using the word defund. Reconstruct, yes. Reallocate, revision, but not defund. Because the reality is, even formerly incarcerated, who am I going to call if someone is breaking in my home? I'm going to call the police, and I'm going to want them to answer. That's just reality. But I think in dealing with individuals with mental health calls and mental health issues, that we need police and their trauma-informed therapists in the same car. Because one has a gun and a taser and some other things. And one has a skill set that I think that therapists and police officers are a great marriage because they complement each other. And I don't think you can have one without the other. And I think with all this planning, even in New York and around the country, that you have to have people that are sane enough, but with mental issues at the table. I think you have to have, like I said, young people at the table, formerly incarcerated people, clergy. I think you have to have a well-rounded table, but they have to have a plan and not just talking. What did you write out? What did you think out? How does this work? Did you flush this out? What does this look like? And I think at the end of whatever the governor is saying, it's going to be more of the same because people are piecemealing something together by April. And I want to know how many trauma-informed therapists they have helping them write this plan. How many formerly incarcerated people, how many people have been brutalized from mental health calls by the police, people's families that have died from these calls. They all need to be at the table to make this actually effective and not just what you say, a show pony. And in this moment, I love New York, but my governor is being a show pony right now. And I don't think that we're going to get what we're looking for even in this. Why? Because too many hands in one stew don't taste good either. And so it has to be done better. But he's not asking real stakeholders. So you're not going to get real solutions. Nobody will call me for a solution. Nobody will call the real trauma-informed therapists, collective people, call John Jay, call college, call people with credible people that they have in their networks. That's not being done. And so we're going to have more of the same. And you're right. Budget lines, there's money. There's always money. There's New York, definitely. There's always money. And we have to budget line and red line where we want the money to go. Are we seeking wellness and communities, or are we seeking lawsuits and payouts? That's just where we're at. We saw right now through the riots and all the things that 2020 has brought. There's a civil suit everywhere in this country. There's people on desk duty all over the country. So do we pay out all over the country, or do we say enough is enough? We seek to make officers and community whole in totality. I believe, Joe, through watching you and Ernie, that you set the blueprint to make America great again for mental health and police and community in totality. This is what I choose to believe. I choose to believe that we can coexist without death all the time. I want to believe that there's a way to get here and stay here. This is what I choose to believe, and this is what I'm going to work for. And you've given me a greater determination to join police community task force and boards so we can get there. And I think that's one of the things that communities need to do as well. Join community task force. Join these meetings so you know what's happening in your precincts, in your local areas, because if you don't go to the meetings, you don't have a voice. I think that's definitely important as well.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of good points there, and I like the call for unity. So I'm gonna transition towards the end there. But I wanted to point out too that we're having this conversation that's very criminal justice centric, but addresses a lot of mental health issues. And on the flip side of this, there are a lot of mental health systems reform conversations happening right now in the city and the state. And, we had not too long ago the Mobile Crisis Response Task Force with a lot of hands in that stew. And I admit I was quite pleased actually with what they came out with when I saw the list, because, the list of what everybody at that meeting wanted was 5 pages long. But they got, several $100 million towards expanding forensic ACT teams and, expanding, doubling some of the mobile crisis capacity in the neighborhoods where we needed it. We have something they call HEAT teams in New York City, which is peers and mental health clinicians just walking the beat, kind of like cops do, just out there in the environment, engaging people, much like our homeless outreach teams will, right? are private service providers. And so I'm gonna end with a little bit of a plug of the work that we do through P2PH, which is to make sure that when big reforms are happening in one sector, that we are involving people from the other sectors that may not typically have a seat at our table. And so, you know, when we're having this criminal justice conversation, it's not just the forensic psychiatrists that we need at the table. It's really a broad swath of mental health service providers that we should be engaging in these conversations, and vice versa. When they're having their conversations about big systems reforms and value-based payment contracts with Medicaid managed care, and half of those terms y'all aren't familiar with, but we need to have our seat at that table, right? Because we need to be saying, hey, because you all don't have the capacity to meet the needs of these people, they're ending up calling 911 when they hit crisis, and we should be doing a better job of engaging those individuals and averting the crisis to begin with. We're not going to be able to solve all of those problems, but we can be tamping them down. And we have seen some successes in those areas, and we want to be able to lift those up. Mount Sinai did a great job of looking at their mobile crisis team capacity and recognizing that they had a lot of frequent utilizers there that were coming from a few congregate supportive housing facilities. And so they went and engaged those folks and did some preventive work there and increased their own capacity to respond to mobile crisis by reducing the crises that were occurring in their catchment area by working on partnerships. And so that's the type of stuff that you know, I love to lift up in these spaces and make sure that, you know, people who are really eye on the prize for criminal justice system are also thinking about how are we impacting the reform structure that's happening on the other side, because the Affordable Care Act's not going away. Medicaid expansion's not going away in the places that have already expanded, and I think it's going to move further. And we're trying to integrate behavioral health services into more traditional kind of primary care services, and that really impacts the way that we can access things as well. And so making sure that we're building those partnerships across bridges. So I will leave there. Joe, I got on my soapbox a little bit at the end about the need for cross-disciplinary dialogue. But I really appreciate Joe and Shawana and Michelle and Shauna and Kathy and Matthew who helped put this together. Again, I did see a couple questions that came up in the Q&A. The link to the full-length documentary is in the email that you got when you registered for the event. So the confirmation email has that link. It is live through midnight tomorrow. I encourage you all to watch it if you have not already, or watch it again so that you don't have to regret that you didn't get a chance to watch it that second time through. And I really appreciate all of y'all taking the time here. We were up around 170 attendees for the majority of this. So certainly an issue that has a lot of interest. And Joe and Shawana, I admire both of you for the work that you do and the persistence and the creativity and the spirit that you bring to the work. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It was an honor, and I appreciated sharing this space with you, Shawana. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Joe. You too.